The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review the feminist frequency video Damsel in Distress Part 2. I already reviewed Part 1,
so if you haven't seen it yet, please check that one out before continuing to watch this one. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the Damsel in Distress.
I agree full-heartedly.
This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
I pointed out in my first review that with the 192 games you referenced, that is less than 1% of all the games I found. How is it systemic or big picture?
I just want to caution viewers that as we delve into more modern games, we will be discussing examples that employ some particularly gruesome and graphic depictions of violence against women.
There are a total of 74 games shown in this episode. She will be showing some scenes handpicked from some of these games. This will end up constituting less than 1% of every game released in this time frame.
I'll do my best to only show what is necessary, but this episode does come with a trigger warning.
Trigger warning? Most games come with warning labels if people feel the content is too much for them.
In our previous episode, we explored the history of the damsel in distress and how the trope became so pervasive in classic-era games from the 80s and early 90s.
Your first video was a bizarre history lesson that bounced all over video game history.
We also explored some of the core reasons why damsel characters are so problematic as representations of women.
You have thus far failed to prove any real-world effects these games have on people. I have already demonstrated that in my first two videos. You can't claim these to be a problem unless you can prove the real-world effects, which there are none.
Now, it might be tempting to think that the damsel in distress was just a product of its time, and that by now, surely the trope must be a thing of the past.
You established in Part 1, the trope is still alive and well in gaming. How can you imply it was a thing of the past when you already established they still exist?
Studied extensively.
Did you actually study this in depth, or just read off a script?
Well, while we have seen a moderate increase in the number of playable female characters, the plot device hasn't gone away.
You cite 192 games between all three Damsel videos. I found over 1,400 playable female characters in lead roles. My numbers don't count playable female characters that are not lead roles.
The plot device hasn't gone away.
I'm not arguing against more playable female characters. It's just the statistics show women are playable more often than they are damsels. So why is it an issue that this trope still exists?
In fact, the damsel in distress has seen a bit of a resurgence in recent years.
You already established in your first video the damsel trope never went away. What the hell are you talking about?
Silence!
Get me out of here. He's hurting me.
What a did.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
You just showed a compilation of 30 games released between 2001 and 2012. Between those years, there were over 6,600 games released. You just showed less than 0.5% of every game released in that time frame.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
If the Titanic hit your iceberg, it would have never sunk, and Jack would still be alive.
Suffice it to say, the trope is alive and well even today.
If it is still alive today, why did you imply it died earlier in your video?
Now, it might be tempting to think that the damsel in distress was just a product of its time, and that by now, surely the trope must be a thing of the past.
And if it is a product of its time, why has it existed since before the invention of the video game?
Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years. At the turn of the 20th century, victimized young women became the cliché of choice for the nascent American film industry. Suffice it to say, the trope is alive and well even today.
Suffice it to say, you don't know your own work as well as I know it.
Developers are largely unwilling to give up the damsel in distress as an easy default motivation for their brooding male heroes or anti-heroes.
You cite less than 1% of every game ever made. How can you accuse developers of being unwilling to get rid of this trope when it is so underused according to your own videos?
Remember that as a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device used by writers, and not necessarily always just a one-dimensional character type entirely defined by victimhood.
The damsel trope can have good writing and portray positive attitudes?
Now and then, damseled characters may be well-written, funny, dynamic, or likable.
If they are well-written, funny, dynamic, and likable, why did you say this in your first video?
The hero's fight to retrieve his stolen property then provides the lazy justification for the actual gameplay.
If it is just a lazy justification for gameplay, then why do writers bother making their damsels more well-written and active?
However, this extra character development tends to make their eventual disempowerment all the more frustrating.
You are still frustrated with the trope no matter what developers do, even though you said it can have value in your first video.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value.
All you are doing is arguing to get rid of the trope altogether, as no incarnation will ever please you personally.
Damsels on the more sassy end of the spectrum may struggle with their captors, or even attempt an escape on their own. Occasionally they may be allowed to offer the hero a last-minute helping hand, or to kick the bad guy while he's down.
Anita said in part 1,
"The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable, but the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures."
Yet in part 2, Anita shows several games that challenge those claims. Just another mind-numbing contradiction in her lazy research.
Studied extensively, but these moments are largely symbolic and typically only happen after the core adventure is over or the danger has passed.
1 minute they are well written, the next moment it's just a token gesture.
Fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures. Periodically, game developers may attempt to build a more fleshed out relationship or emotional bond between the damseled character and the male protagonist. In the most decidedly patronizing examples, depictions of female vulnerability are used as an easy way for writers to trigger an emotional reaction in male players.
How specifically were those last 2 games sexist, and how did they have no value?
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. As we discussed in our first episode, when female characters are damseled, their ostensible agency is removed and they're reduced to a state of victimhood.
You keep bouncing between well-written and tough damsels to weak damsels.
So narratives that frame intimacy, love, or romance as something that blossoms from or hinges upon the disempowerment and victimization of women are extremely troubling because they tend to reinforce the widespread regressive notion that women in vulnerable, passive, or subordinate positions are somehow desirable because of their powerlessness.
You can't claim these to be a problem unless you can prove the real-world effects, which there are none.
Unfortunately, these types of stories also help to perpetuate the paternalistic belief that power imbalances within romantic relationships are appealing, expected, or normal.
You can't claim these to be a problem unless you can prove the real-world effects, which there are none.
Okay, so we know that the damsel in distress is alive and well in gaming.
You established in part 1 the trope is still alive and well in gaming. Then you spent a great deal of part 2 explaining the trope is still alive and well in gaming, even though you established that in part 1.
Studied extensively, but that's not the full picture. There's an even more insidious side to the story.
The question is, how big is the story you are about to tell us?
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
This better be a systemic and big picture story, or you are wasting everyone's time according to your own words.
Over the past decade, game companies have been desperately searching for ways to stand out in a market increasingly oversaturated with very similar products. As a consequence, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of games attempting to cut through the clutter by being as dark and edgy as possible. So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women.
Combining it with other tropes? I'm going to play a clip from part 1, and I'm going to play the whole clip so no one can accuse me of editing Anita out of context.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. So the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series, while our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc.
Let me break that down.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory.
Anita is getting ready to show us games that have combinations of tropes.
So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliche by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women.
She already said these are separate tropes that are not part of the damsel trope by itself.
However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself.
The damsel in distress generally focuses on the primary damsel.
So the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series, while our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt.
With the definition Anita just gave us, this expands the traditional storytelling element so she can call anything a damsel in distress.
All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
This includes characters that are not the primary damsel, that are not vital to the story, and that are in some cases beyond saving. The primary damsel does not always survive, but the primary damsel is generally saved in the majority of games featuring the trope.
I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
Notice she said I identified and common cocktails?
I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails.
For the next section, pay close attention.
Which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
Anita just said she is choosing games that are not standard damsel games and that are not typical portrayals of the damsel.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
Anita carefully crafts a great deal of what is coming up by hand-picking games that combine different tropes that she already defined as not being part of the damsel in distress trope itself.
The term women in refrigerators was coined in the late 1990s by comic book writer Gail Simone to describe the trend of female comic book characters who are routinely brutalized or killed off as a plot device designed to move the male character's story arc forward.
Without the added tropes that treat the damsel or other characters horribly, the damsel trope by itself isn't nearly as bad as Anita is about to portray.
But the gruesome death of women for shock value is especially prevalent in modern gaming. The women in refrigerator trope is used as the cornerstone of some of the most famous contemporary video games. It provides the core motivational hook behind both the Max Payne and the God of War series, for example.
I'm going to start keeping track of every game she uses from here on out to see how widespread this trope combination issue is.
In each case, the protagonist's wife and daughter are brutally murdered, and their deaths are then used by the developers as a pretext for their inevitable bloody revenge quest.
Whether or not those last two games are standard damsel games, I will count them as 2. We are at 2 games total.
It's interesting to note that the reverse scenario, games hinging on a woman vowing revenge for her murdered boyfriend or husband, are practically non-existent.
Practically non-existent. She never said they don't exist. You have to carefully analyze Anita's language, as I'm about to demonstrate why.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd. Which is one of the reasons why the scene from Disney's Wreck-It Ralph is so humorous.
Anita went to a clip from a cartoon to say how humorous it is when the role is reversed. And Anita is intentionally picking one of the most silly scenes there are when the role is reversed. In the movie Salt, Angelina Jolie's boyfriend is murdered, and at the end, she escapes and plans to hunt down the other KA sleeper agents.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd.
In Kill Bill, Uma Thurman's fiancé is murdered at her wedding, and she seeks revenge by killing all the other assassins and Bill himself.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd.
In Terminator 1, Kyle Reese dies at the end, and Sarah Connor has to kill the Terminator herself to save her unborn child, so he can save the human race.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd.
How is the role reversal absurd when I can so easily find movies that are not absurd?
Studied extensively.
The only thing Anita studied is how to carefully craft her words and cherry-pick clips to frame a narrative that is not 100% accurate.
I could do a very long video just exploring this one trope in gaming.
All you showed us was Max Payne and God of War, cherry-picked clips from a cartoon, and crafted a narrative that is not factually accurate. Then said you could make a very long video exploring this one trope.
But today I want to look at how the woman in refrigerator is connected to the damsel in distress, and specifically the ways game developers have found to combine these two plot devices. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes.
A reminder that combining tropes doesn't necessarily reflect the damsel trope as it is traditionally implemented in Anita's own words.
One popular variation is to simply use both tropes in the same plotline, so as to have the male protagonist's wife stuffed in the fridge while his daughter is damseled.
She just said one popular variation. Let's see how many games she shows us.
In Outlaws, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Kane and Lynch, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Prototype 2, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Inversion, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Asura's Wrath, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Dishonored, the Empress is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue her daughter.
6 games that fit that specific narrative. That is 8 games so far. And I will also point out it was not the damsel that died, it was the wife in most cases.
Your wife is brutally murdered, 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 the Empress is brutally murdered.
These are characters within the story, but the main story revolves around the damsel and the hero.
It's no coincidence that the fridge plot device and the damsel plot device work in much the same way. Both involve female characters who have been reduced to complete states of powerlessness by the narrative, one via kidnapping, the other via murder.
This is a video about damsels. You already did a video about the women in refrigerators. If you want to talk about them so much, why don't you just point people to that video?
The two plot devices used together then allow developers to exploit both the revenge motivation and the good old-fashioned save the girl motivation.
Anita already established separate tropes are not part of the damsel trope.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes.
She already said they are separate tropes and keeps emphasizing the other tropes with a handful of cherry-picked games.
Believe it or not, there is another more insidious version of this particular trope hybrid, which I called the damsel in the refrigerator.
Notice how she said which I called?
Which I called the damsel in the refrigerator.
Anita is making up her own tropes by combining different tropes.
Now, you may be asking yourself, how can a fridged woman still be in distress? Since by definition, being fridged usually sort of requires being dead. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
Which means a refrigerated damsel is no longer a typical damsel in distress. You just made up the refrigerated damsel trope so you can lead your audience to believe the damsel in distress is worse than it actually is.
Studied extensively.
Let's continue.
Well, here's how it works. The damsel in the refrigerator occurs when the hero's sweetheart is brutally murdered, and her soul is then trapped or abducted by the villain. This oh-so-dark and edgy twist provides players with a double dose of female disempowerment and allows developers to again exploit both the revenge motivation and the saving the damsel motivation, but this time with the same woman at the same time.
Anita just invented a trope by combining tropes so she could shame developers.
And allows developers to again exploit both the revenge motivation and the saving the damsel motivation, but this time with the same woman at the same time.
And she is doing it with a handful of cherry-picked games.
This trope combination can be traced back to old-school side-scrollers like Splatterhouse 2 and Ghouls and Ghosts, but the damsel in the refrigerator has definitely become a more popular trend in recent years.
Combining tropes does not make the damsel trope as bad as you keep implying.
This trope combination can be traced back to old-school side-scrollers like Splatterhouse 2 and Ghouls and Ghosts. In Medieval 2, your murdered girlfriend's soul is stolen and you must fight to save her. In The Darkness 2, your murdered girlfriend's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her. In Shadows of the Damned, your murdered girlfriend's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her. In Dante's Inferno, your murdered wife's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her. In Castlevania Lords of Shadow, your wife's soul is trapped on Earth and you must fight to free her.
She only showed 7 games for that trope combination. So far, we are at 15 games total.
The damsel in the refrigerator is part of a larger trend of throwing women under the bus in increasingly gruesome ways, in an apparent attempt to interject what I'll loosely refer to as mature themes.
Have you seen how men are treated in media?
Developers must be hoping that by exploiting sensationalized images of brutalized women, it'll be enough to fool gamers into thinking that their games are becoming more emotionally sophisticated. But the truth is, there's nothing mature about most of these stories, and many of them cross the line into blatant misogyny.
Misogyny? Bayonetta was designed by a woman, and you said this about her.
But I'm not really here to discuss the overly sexualized adolescent male fantasy that Bayonetta is, because it's basically a choose-your-own patriarchal adventure porno fantasy.
Women can be just as guilty as pushing these tropes as men, and several of these games have women that work on them. Anita is only holding men accountable in an industry where women push these tropes as well.
Since what we're really talking about here are depictions of violence against women, it might be useful to quickly define what I mean by that term. When I say violence against women, I'm primarily referring to images of women being victimized, or when violence is linked specifically to a character's gender or sexuality.
Let me break down that last section.
Since what we're really talking about,
Anita said we, but only she is talking.
it might be useful to quickly define what I mean by that term.
When Anita says what I mean, Anita means she is defining it.
When I say violence against women,
Anita is still defining it.
I'm primarily referring to images of women being victimized,
Anita is still defining it.
or when violence is linked specifically to a character's gender or sexuality.
And she finishes off the definition. Why is this an issue? I'll show you.
Female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims.
Anita defined every aspect of the type of violence and portrayals she is talking about, so no one can use the standard counter arguments.
Since what we're really talking about, quickly define what I mean. When I say violence against women, I'm primarily referring to,
And the standard counter argument is most women are not portrayed the way Anita is talking about.
female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims.
Remember how Anita started this video?
This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
If it is systemic and big picture, why do you have to carefully craft your language to only include the games you want to talk about while excluding any potential counter-arguments? All I see is a bunch of carefully crafted words and cherry-picked games.
Studied extensively.
Let's continue.
As I mentioned in our last video, the damsel in distress doesn't always have to be accompanied by a heroic rescue.
Anita is technically right because she technically said that.
While our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt.
She also said it is often grouped with other separate tropes.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes.
And she also said this at the beginning of her video.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
What Anita has to do is provide us with a big enough list to prove these specific narratives are systemic and big picture. So far, I've counted 15 games.
Sometimes the hero fails to save the woman in question, either because he arrives too late, or because, surprise twist, she's been dead the whole time.
Here we are again with another list of cherry-picked games.
All my power.
6 new games in that section. 21 games so far that are trope combinations with the damsel.
Or in the case of the 2009 version of Bionic Commando, not only has your wife been dead the whole time, but turns out she's actually a part of your bionic arm.
Now we are at 22 games.
Yes, you heard that correctly. His wife is his arm. God.
You may be laughing at the arm, but I'm shaking my head at your video.
But the most extreme and gruesome variant of this trend is when developers combine the damsel in distress with the mercy killing. This usually happens when the player character must murder the woman in peril for her own good.
Is she making up another variation?
I like to call this happy little gem the euthanized damsel.
Yep, she did it again.
Typically, the damsel has been mutilated or deformed in some way by the villain, and the only option left of the hero is to put her out of her misery himself.
Let's see how many games she found this time.
Splatterhouse, Castlevania Lament of Innocence, in Breath of Fire 4, in Gears of War 2, in Tenchu Shadow Assassins. A particularly egregious example can be found in Grand Theft Auto 3.
6 more games. Now we are up to 28.
Sometimes these killings happen via cutscene, while other games ask the player to participate directly by pulling the trigger themselves.
Oh good, she's still trying to make her case. Maybe she can convince me.
In the Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles remake, in Duke Nukem 3D, Duke Nukem Forever, Borderlands 2, the end of Alone in the Dark, the Wii game Pandora's Tower, in the 2006 shooter Prey.
7 more games. We are now up to 35.
These damseled women are written so as to subordinate themselves to men. They submissively accept their grisly fate and will often beg the player to perform violence on them, giving men direct and total control over whether they live or die, even saying thank you with their dying breath. In other words, these women are asking for it.
We never see men begging to be killed by other men to progress the story.
Do it, Rico!
If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
You'll be killed! Is that what you want? If it's the only way for me to beat you!
Or how about a man being begged to be killed by a woman?
The euthanized damsel is the darkest and edgiest of these trope hybrids, but it's also an extension of a larger pattern in gaming narratives where male protagonists are forced to fight their own loved ones who have been possessed or brainwashed by villains.
An extension of larger patterns of gaming narratives? You just said some of the following games are extensions of a narrative that has nothing to do with the damsel in distress.
But it's also an extension of a larger pattern in gaming narratives.
Time to add to Anita's list.
God of War Ghosts of Sparta, and Grabbed by the Ghoulies, and dozens of other titles as well.
There were 6 new games, so that is a grand total of 41.
These stories conjure up supernatural situations in which domestic violence perpetrated by men against women who have lost control of themselves not only appears justified, but is presented as an altruistic act done for the woman's own good.
You have to prove real-world effects games have with scientific studies. You never proved that.
Of course, if you look at any of these games in isolation, you'll be able to find incidental narrative circumstances that can be used to explain away the inclusion of violence against women as a plot device.
As opposed to violence against men as a plot device? You only showed 41 games so far that are combinations with the damsel trope. Why is this even worth discussion?
But just because a particular event might make sense within the internal logic of a fictional narrative, that doesn't in and of itself justify its use.
Similar things happen to men, and so far, you are only talking about 41 games, and you never prove the real-world effects. Why is this an issue in need of attention?
Games don't exist in a vacuum, and therefore can't be divorced from the larger cultural context of the real world.
Games do not influence society.
I think it's important to critically engage with video games and comic books and movies and TV shows because it's a reflection of our society.
They reflect society.
It's especially troubling in light of the serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women facing the female population on this planet.
What is troubling me is you never proved the effects these games have on people, and now you are using real-world tragedies to justify your criticism of the video game industry.
Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States. And on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day.
I have not seen one study linking video games to any of these crimes. You are exploiting the suffering of other women to further your own career.
Research consistently shows that people of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them.
Research consistently shows there is no proven link between video games and real-world violence.
In the same vein, abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it.
If a man is abusive, he has a problem, and changes in video games will never change him. And you are talking about abusive men in specific. You have not established games make men abusive.
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
You have not established games make men abusive.
Even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women, nevertheless they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
Why is it dangerously irresponsible to make these games if you just said they don't condone violence?
It should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women, even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women.
What a tangled web your videos weave.
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy.
Considering you cite less than 1% of every game ever made for your Damsel videos and completely ignore every other portrayal of women, I'd assume developers spend more time than you give them credit for portraying women better than you imply.
Most probably just haven't given much thought to the underlying messages their games are sending, and in many cases, developers have backed themselves into a corner with their own game mechanics.
I could use your same logic against your videos by saying you've backed yourself into a corner with invalid arguments and unproven facts based on lazy research.
Studied extensively. When violence is the primary gameplay mechanic, and therefore the primary way that the player engages with the game world, it severely limits the options for problem solving. The player is then forced to use violence to deal with almost all situations because it's the only meaningful mechanic available, even if that means beating up or killing the women they're meant to love or care about.
You just define violence as dealing with all situations.
The player is then forced to use violence to deal with almost all situations because it's the only meaningful mechanic available.
Yet you only specify women when you just said it applies to men and women.
Even if that means beating up or killing the women they're meant to love or care about.
All Anita did was edit specific clips together and carefully craft her language.
One of the really insidious things about systemic and institutional sexism is that most often regressive attitudes and harmful gender stereotypes are maintained and perpetuated unintentionally.
I'm still waiting for you to prove that to be true in a real-world long-term context, as most of your studies are short-term studies that do not prove long-term effects.
Likewise, engaging with these games is not going to magically transform players into raging sexists. We typically don't have a monkey see, monkey do direct cause and effect relationship with the media we consume.
Then why did you just talk about real-world violence to turn around and say it doesn't necessarily affect us to a major degree?
Serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States. More than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day. People of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them. Abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it. Likewise, engaging with these games is not going to magically transform players into raging sexists. We typically don't have a monkey see, monkey do direct cause and effect relationship with the media we consume.
Anita just prefaced her argument that these games don't have a huge impact with real-world tragedies. Anita Sarkeesian is exploiting the tragedies of real-world women to justify her criticism of the gaming industry.
Cultural influence works in much more subtle and complicated ways. However, media narratives do have a powerful cultivation effect, helping to shape cultural attitudes and opinions.
Media narratives that shape opinions. Let's see how Anita applies that logic to the video game industry.
So when developers exploit sensationalized images of brutalized, mutilated, and victimized women over and over and over again, it tends to reinforce the dominant gender paradigm, which casts men as aggressive and commanding, and frames women as subordinate and dependent.
I found more lead female characters than you found Damsel games. By your logic, game developers spend more time portraying women as lead characters than they do as damsels. Statistically speaking, you are arguing developers do a great job portraying women most of the time, as you only cite games that fit your narrative. Now to show you an example of how Anita plays this game, I'm going to choose her words with a clip I pick.
It tends to reinforce the dominant gender paradigm, which casts men as aggressive and commanding.
That man didn't look aggressive or commanding. So you may be asking, how does this apply to Anita's videos?
So when developers exploit sensationalized images of brutalized, mutilated, and victimized women over and over and over again,
Anita is explaining how developers portray women over and over again with a picture she chooses, even though, so far, she has only showed 41 games that fall outside the traditional damsel trope.
This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming.
There is nothing about these trope combinations of these specific scenarios that are a plot device or pattern that is most commonly associated with women in gaming, as you only showed us 41 games.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
How is this big picture or systemic? I can frame a narrative however I want with carefully crafted language and hand-picked games and pictures.
Although these stories use female trauma as the catalyst to set the plot elements in motion, these are not stories about women.
Just as any story where a lead female protagonist's brother, father, or son dies, it's not necessarily a story about men.
Nor are they concerned with the struggles of women navigating the mental, emotional, and physical ramifications of violence.
Game developers are not doctors or psychologists. They design games their customers want to play. If the developers didn't do their job, this would not be a multi-billion-dollar industry, and you wouldn't have a video series on YouTube.
Instead, these are strictly male-centered stories, in which, more often than not, the tragic damsels are just empty shells, whose deaths are depicted as far more meaningful than their lives.
If their deaths were more meaningful than their lives, then why do the lead male characters care about them? If their lives weren't meaningful, then why do male characters try so hard to rescue them and have an emotional attachment to their death?
Generally, they're completely defined by their purity, innocence, kindness, beauty, or sensuality.
If that is all a damsel is defined by, then why did you say this earlier?
Now and then, damseled characters may be well written, funny, dynamic, or likable.
Did you establish that their purity, innocence, kindness, beauty, or sensuality weren't well-written, funny, dynamic, or likable? Anita used clips from The Darkness and The Darkness 2, so I decided to look up some reviews for these games. The Darkness 1 received mostly positive reviews for both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It starts with, "This game is amazing," but it ends with, "and don't get me started about the story, which is enthralling and moving," which to me implies good writing influenced some of the scores. Amazing game. The best game to come out this year so far. The storyline is engaging, the atmosphere is wonderful, the voice acting flawless, and the graphics stunning. At least some people thought Part 1 was well written. Even though The Darkness 2 fell slightly below Part 1 in overall score, it still received positive praise from many. For Part 2, I looked at the less positive reviews to see what they said about the story. The Darkness 2 is a good FPS, but that's thanks to its atmosphere and storytelling, clearly not to its gameplay itself. That person didn't like the gameplay, but did compliment the storytelling. Although the gameplay was short, it was good. The story was what shined, though. That person also liked the storytelling. Anita intentionally leaves out character traits when it suits her narrative.
In short, they're just symbols meant to invoke the essence of an artificial feminine ideal.
She already said they can be well written, but overlooks that when she wants to frame them a specific way.
Now and then, Damsel's characters may be well written, funny, dynamic, or likable. Periodically, game developers may attempt to build a more fleshed out relationship or emotional bond between the damsel character and the male protagonist. In short, they're just symbols meant to invoke the essence of an artificial feminine ideal.
Case and point.
In fact, these games usually frame the loss of the woman as something that has been unjustly taken from the male hero.
In the vast majority of damsel stories, a hero seeks to rescue someone. Anita never established it was the male hero's property, just that a hero wants to rescue someone in need of rescuing.
The implication being that she belonged to him, that she was his possession. Once wronged, the hero must go get his possessions back, or at least exact a heavy price for their loss.
If she wasn't a slave, how are you defining these women as possessions of men? They are not possessions within the context of the story. Stop making things up.
On the surface, victimized women are framed as the reason for the hero's torment. But if we dig a little deeper into the subtext, I'd argue that the true source of the pain stems from feelings of weakness and or guilt over his failure to perform his socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children.
Let's break that last clip down.
On the surface, victimized women are framed as the reason for the hero's torment.
She established what the general implication is.
But if we dig a little deeper into the subtext,
she said we, but she is the only one talking.
I'd argue that the true source of the pain stems from feelings of weakness and or guilt over his failure to perform his socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children.
She said I'd argue, as in she is telling you her opinion, and then she frames that opinion with one hand-picked clip.
And I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl.
She just found a way to make the hero into someone that is part of the patriarchy.
Socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children.
If you understand some branches of modern feminism, the word patriarchy is some sort of a male conspiracy to control women.
In this way, these failed hero stories are really about the perceived loss of masculinity, and then the quest to regain that masculinity.
If he lost his masculinity, then why did he man up to do the job? Men who lose their masculinity generally cower down and leave it to the real men. So the hero never lost his masculinity.
Primarily by exerting dominance and control through the performance of violence on others.
You said he lost his masculinity, and then went and did something masculine.
In this way, these failed hero stories are really about the perceived loss of masculinity, primarily by exerting dominance and control through the performance of violence on others.
I don't even have to jump around in your videos to find contradictions. You do it for me.
Consequently, violent revenge-based narratives repeated ad nauseum
She said repeated ad nauseum while using clips from games she just covered. If it is repeated so often, why do you use such a limited selection of games? 41 total for the combined tropes, and less than 1% of every game ever made for your entire Damsel series.
Can also be harmful to men.
You never established these games were harmful.
Because they help to further limit the possible responses men are allowed to have when faced with death or tragedy.
If every man in these games went to the funeral and spent the rest of their lives sitting at home, these games would be boring. At that point, we might as well play Gone Home. And if I had to sit through a clone of Gone Home every time I played a male protagonist, it would turn into a depression quest, as I'd be bored out of my mind.
This is unfortunate because interactive media has the potential to be a brilliant medium for people of all genders to explore difficult or painful subjects.
All of the games you just mentioned were designed to have fun. There is no reason developers need to stop making these games for the purpose of exploring difficult or painful subjects.
So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. Death touches all of our lives eventually, and as such, it's often an integral part of dramatic storytelling. To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd. But it's important to consider the ways that women's deaths are framed and examine how and why they're written.
They were framed a certain way in 41 games, and you established that they can be well written and portrayed a variety of ways.
Now and then, damseled characters may be well written, funny, dynamic, or likable. Generally, they're completely defined by their purity, innocence, kindness, beauty, or sensuality.
And you said, for women to never die in storytelling is absurd.
So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd.
This video is a waste of time in your own words.
Studied extensively.
If this was the middle of a public debate, it would probably look something like this.
There are some games that try to explore loss, death, and grief in more genuine or authentic ways that do not sensationalize or exploit victimized women.
If these games already exist and you can find them, why did you spend a great deal of time attacking 41 games, most of which are not typical damsel in distress stories?
Dear Esther, Passage, and To the Moon are a few indie games that investigate these themes in creative, innovative, and sometimes beautiful ways.
All I heard was developers should make these games because developers are already making these games.
These more contemplative style games are a hopeful sign, but they're still largely the exception to the rule.
Some people like these games or they wouldn't be big sellers. I hate to resort to this tactic. Leave the boys alone and go play with your own toys.
A sizable chunk of the industry is still unfortunately trapped in the established pattern of building game narratives on the backs of brutalized female bodies.
Game narratives on the back of brutalized female bodies.
Female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims.
You already told us that we cannot talk about games outside of that context.
The dark and edgy trope cocktails that we've discussed in this episode are not isolated incidents or obscure anomalies.
You only showed 41 games that are part of this cocktail. By definition, they are isolated incidents and obscure anomalies.
Instead, they represent an ongoing, recurring pattern in modern gaming narratives.
Ongoing and reoccurring in 41 games out of over 6,600 released in that time frame. Less than 1% of games between 2001 and 2012.
Studied extensively.
Study harder, Anita. Study harder.
In most cases, the damseled characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead, which is obviously not a huge improvement from her perspective.
In most cases? Earlier, it wasn't even the damsel that died. It was the wife. You said so yourself.
Your wife is brutally murdered. 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 The Empress is brutally murdered. In most cases, the damseled characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead.
And how did you prove this happens in most cases?
This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
There is nothing systemic or big picture about 41 games with the trope combination.
I know this episode has been a little bit grim.
A little bit grim? This whole video was a disaster. With all the Kickstarter money you raised to give us an in-depth analysis, you produced 41 games with the trope combination you said was a common theme.
I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails.
The only way someone could accomplish such a pathetic list is if it were based on a bunch of lazy research.
Studied extensively, but please join me next time for the third and final installment covering the damsel in distress.
I will be joining you in my review of your third video at a later date,
where we'll take a look at some titles that attempt to flip the script on the damsel.
The only script I'll be flipping is the script you are reading off of.
And then we'll go on a quest to find examples of the elusive dude in distress role reversal.
For me, reviewing your work is a quest.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.